Hi everyone. I just want to do a few videos talking about security and compliance around the Azure AI component space. And today specifically I want to look at the AI Studio and the components that make that up, and look at the encryption requirements that many of the compliance standards have. Let's just jump over to Azure and I'll show you exactly what I mean, and we'll start going through it. Okay, so here we are in Azure Resource Manager, and you can see that I've already deployed a few resources so that I can show you what I mean in the Defender for Cloud. I needed to deploy these ahead of time so that the compliance red flag showed up, if you will. So these resources here, the Azure AI Hub and Project, which surface themselves in the AI Studio, you can see I've deployed here. I've just put GUI in the name so it makes it easier for us to decipher. And then these resources here were automatically created for us because they're a requirement for these components. And you can see they surface here in the Azure AI Studio. We've got some connected resources that as I mentioned, created when I deployed the hub and in turn the project. And then of course we can click through to the hub and the project and actually start using the AI Studio to generate some prompts and some responses and so forth. But that's not the focus here today, and I'll probably do a separate video on how to understand all of these services, the AI Studio, the AI Hub, and so on and so forth. AI Service and OpenAI Service is a lot to understand, which we'll do in a separate video. But what I want to focus in on today is if we look at the compliance for these, and there's a lot of people developing apps that use AI resources, and depending on your target market, maybe you're targeting lawyers or accountants and there's a high threshold for compliance. You'll see I have enabled some regulatory compliance templates here in Defender for Cloud, and at the moment I've picked on the NIST compliance standard, but also this certainly shows up in SOC 2 if you're looking to your apps targeted towards the accounting profession. And if I scroll down here, you can see that these machine learning workspaces, and what that means in terms of workspaces is the hub and the project, they're expecting to have, or this compliance standard wants you to bring a customer managed key, which is fairly common. A lot of Azure resources require this for compliance. You can see here also the storage account that got created, and the AI service that's connected, they all want customer managed keys. So if I jump into that, you'll see that it's pointing out my unhealthy resources as the two workspaces that I just showed you. And if I jump back to those resources, what's interesting about the AI Hub and Project, essentially what makes up the Azure Studio or starts to form the Azure Studio, is they don't have the ability in the GUI for you to bring your own key. And I'll show you what I mean by going to a storage account and going to encryption. Most resources will give you the opportunity to just through the GUI, click through to encryption and choose customer managed keys. And you just need to sort of follow the wizard, I guess here, and find your key vault and select a key or enter the key URI of your key. Now I'm not going to do that, but I just really wanted to demonstrate that wasn't, or these services aren't encrypted as we sort of looked at in Defender for Cloud. Let's cancel out of that, go back to the resource group, and you'll see that the hub resource doesn't really have much to offer. It just really wants me to launch the Azure AI Studio, and then it surfaces the projects that are connected here and the networking, but there's nothing down here that allows me to encrypt. So what I want to demo today is how we actually go about deploying this service in a compliant way. And to do that, we're going to need to use, or I'm going to demonstrate it using infrastructure as code and specifically Azure Bicep. So let's have a look at that. I'll get the deployment underway and then we'll just step through a few of the things that it's deploying. Let's jump over to Visual Studio Code and we'll have a look. Cool. Okay, so here we are in VS Code, and what I'm going to do, because it takes a while to deploy, and I can always speed stuff up if I need to in the edit, but I'm just going to kick off this pre-baked deployment, if you will, and let that start running. And as it starts running, I'll just point out some of the things that are going on here. Now I've got a main file, a main Bicep file, which if you're familiar with Bicep, and then calling modules you'll probably recognize as a fairly standard practice, and I'm feeding in some fairly standard parameters, I think, except for this one is quite interesting, where I've got a first deployment parameter, where I'll just explain that, I guess, in brief. If I was going to redeploy over the top this same template, I'd just change that. Apologies, that should have actually been true when I ran that, and I changed this to false. The reason is I'm in some of these other modules here, I'm creating some keys for encryption, and this particular set of modules sets an expiry date on those keys, which is another separate compliance matter. But for this demo, I won't worry too much about changing that or correcting that, and it's not required to show the encryption that I want to show on these machine learning workspaces. Otherwise, I'm just feeding in a couple of parameters to name the resources that we're deploying. But if we get into the resources that we are deploying alongside the Azure Studio resources, and when I say Azure Studio, I really just mean the hub and the project resources, because Studio itself is not really a first-party resource in Azure. And I can show you what I mean here. I'll quickly jump back to my browser and show you that if I go to, this is a different tenant, if I go to the AI Studio or the AI services, you can see I've got no AI services deployed in this tenant, but I can still load the Azure Studio. It's just a starting point, really, where I can go and I can actually deploy the resources directly from here. But this is a blank studio with nothing in it, so I would need to go and deploy a hub to work with. So let's jump back to our other tenant, or to VS Code. Okay, so back in VS Code, I just want to point out the other supporting resources, if you will, that need to be deployed alongside the AI Studio resources. So we've got the storage account, which is in another module here, storage.bicep. I won't go into the details there. I think storage accounts are pretty straightforward. Similarly, we're deploying a key vault. Now I'm also deploying some keys, and then I'm also deploying some role assignments, and that's because I have a user assigned identity for the encryption, and then I'm assigning the appropriate roles for those role assignments. So there's a few moving parts here. Here's the key vault access user assignment for the user identity. And then finally, we're deploying the AI Studio module, and I just will jump into the AI Studio module that I've written so you can see the encryption piece. What the important part here really is we need to give the AI hub an identity, and here's the user assigned identity resource ID that I'm feeding in from the previous module. And now this is probably quite interesting. You perhaps are wondering why I've given the identity type of system assigned and user assigned, when technically you only need the user assigned for the bring your own key encryption. And the reason is, in my testing, what I found is the project that gets attached to the hub oftentimes will get stuck in deployment if you only have user assigned identity. So I've given it both. And then the other piece to the encryption is this section down here, where you've got encryption, and you tell Azure Resource Manager the user assigned identity that you're using for the encryption and to access the appropriate keys, and how you construct the identifier for the key URI is also interesting here. This particular resource requires you to feed in the key version, which is perhaps different from some other resources where you can just give it the key URI, and of course the resource ID of the key vault. This construct here, I think, is probably the most important to get right. And then if you just deploy a user assigned identity, in theory should also be enough. But interestingly, I found the project part of the deployment deploys better if you have system assigned and user assigned. And then when you deploy the project resource, it's a lot more straightforward. There's very little to it. You just really associate your project to your hub, and it inherits all of those encryption settings. If you try and configure those encryption settings in your project, then it will fail. So just keep it basic on the project, attach it to your hub, and it will inherit all that stuff. That's really it. You can see here I've got some diagnostic settings attached to those resources that I'm deploying. Again, that's for compliance purposes, but it's not the focus of the video today. So I'm probably just going to leave that there. I'll speed this up in the edit so you don't have to wait for the deployment to complete, and then we'll take a look at the deployed resources when it's done. Okay, so we're back and it looks like that deployment has completed. Let's just jump over to Azure Resource Manager in the browser, and I've got the deployment already up in the background. I was keeping an eye on it running. You can see we've deployed all our resources, and if we jump over to the resource group, there's actually one other thing I wanted to point out. So we've got all our resources in the resource group, which I've handily named Bicep, so you can see those are the ones that we're deploying, and I've accidentally added in an extra prefix, but that Bicep prefix is carried through to all of my resources. They contain Bicep in the name, so you can see this is the stuff that we just deployed with the Bicep infrastructure as code templates. And I suppose things were already here. Let's jump into the machine learning workspaces in question that we wanted to bring our own key for encryption. So as before, there is no place in the GUI to enable the encryption. But if we look at the JSON view of the resource that we have deployed, you can see the stuff that I wrote in Bicep about encryption is here, and it's enabled using my user assigned identity. It's got my key vault properties, and if I scroll across here on the key identifier, you can see that it's got the specific key with the version. The string interpolation has concatenated that together for me. And I've got my key vault ID, great. But also in the encryption, you'll notice that there's a Cosmos DB resource ID, a storage account resource ID, and a search account resource ID. So there's 3 more resources involved in the encryption that I didn't deploy. They were nothing to do with my code. So what's going on here? How does that come into play? And I'll very quickly, in brief, explain this, I guess. What happens is when you deploy through the GUI, the workspaces are encrypted actually, but using the platform managed key, and these resources do also exist, but they're managed by Microsoft. So they don't appear in your subscription, in your tenancy. You don't see them, but they are there. And this is sort of the case with what's happening here. These are also managed by Microsoft, but because we've brought our own key, those resources are created for us by Microsoft in our tenancy. So we do see them and we do actually pay for them, but we don't manage them. And you can see the resources here. So it's created a resource group for me. It's just generated this name based on the resource group where we've deployed our resources. So there's an Azure ML prefix and then like a random string on the end. And if we go into that resource group, you can see those resources have been created. Now, basically with these, don't touch them. They're there, but you don't need to do anything with them. And in fact, if you try and deploy your own ones because you want them to meet your own naming convention or whatever, then that simply fails. So just leave that. Let Microsoft do it for you. It's all good. When you delete the resources from here, specifically the project and the hub, that resource group will get deleted for you. So just don't touch it. It's 100% managed for you. And you can see that explained here in the documentation about configuring your own keys. And I'll include the link to this documentation in the show notes that explains basically the permissions that you need and what's happening. But you can see here it explains how the metadata is stored, which is these services that I just described. And if you read through it in detail, it goes on to explain how it's managed by Microsoft and not to edit them. So that really summarizes that. The final thing, which I would have to film tomorrow if I was going to show you, is back in Defender for Cloud. Excuse me for all the jumping around. If I look at the regulatory compliance, Defender for Cloud is notoriously slow at reflecting the changes in new resources or the security state, if you will, of these resources. So it's not going to show in here, but in this time I've picked on the SOC compliance. If I were to come back here tomorrow, we'd see there'd be 2 of 4 failed resources, because now I've got 4 machine learning workspaces and 2 of them are in fact compliant. So if I deleted the other 2, then would be all good to go. And similarly, the key vault that I've deployed and the storage account that I've deployed with the and the infrastructure as code deployment meet all these compliance restrictions. So that's really it for this session. Let me know in the comments if you want me to make these bicep templates available in my GitHub template, in my GitHub repo, or if there's anything else in the AiOps space that you want to learn about, or the compliance space, or perhaps both. Until next time, cheers.